It was a piece of business that comes along once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. Gorsky changed my life. I remember his first visit to the shop. You couldn't fail to notice him, even in a city like London, in which millions are bent on attracting attention. He was quietly remarkable, foreign, expensive somehow, still, even when he moved, his volume turned down permanently. His melancholy muzzle was equine and aristocratic, and his tailored worsteds so ripely English that at first I thought he could only be Prussian. A lot of redundant Deutsche princes dabble in antiques and art in these reaches of Knightsbridge and Chelsea. They often punch above their meagre monetary weight when it comes to tailoring, these von thises and von thats. He possessed billions, more money than anyone can surely spend, let alone need in a lifetime. He dressed the part too, but you had to look closely to notice it. His money did not shout. It whispered in the rustle of whitest Egyptian cotton, finest cashmere, and in the ticking of the most precise platinum watch mechanisms ever made. And although I spent half my life staring out of the shop window, trying to guess the birthplace of each occasional passerby, Russia did not even cross my mind. Narrow and chiseled like a tall crystal vase, with blue eyes set a touch too near his long straight nose, his face made him look taller than he was, and like a creature from another era. The Russians looked tougher, beefier, and coarser, even when they were undeniably handsome. I don't mean Russians in general, of course, but the Russians in this handful of London's richest postcodes. In Russia, their lives had spun a full circle. They grew up in shared apartments, made billions in crude oil, gas, or sophisticated scams, spent it on houses, horses, whores, and occasionally hired killers, and finally returned to playing cards with each other just as they did in the bad old communist days, only now surrounded by squads of bodyguards. I should have guessed that he was Jewish too, but in the end his Jewishness mattered to him and Natalia Summerscale more than it mattered to me. They were Russian. I am not. I am from a small and insignificant nation in an insignificant corner of Europe, and am glad this is so. For this story, my nationality matters only in the negative, only insofar as I was neither English nor Russian. You could say I am tumbleweed, a species that disengages from its roots once matured. The condition of exile was not altogether unpleasant. I had chosen it for myself. That spring and summer in London were as cold as November. People would walk into the shop, shudder, say something about the weather, then stare at the book spines on the shelves while they got warm, or until they spied a title they wanted, inspected a copy and made a note to order it online. Although it cost £8,000 a month in rent alone, Finch's bookshop might as well have been a showroom for the internet book trade. The morning he first asked me for a quick chat, if he might, I watched him emerge from a long silver Bentley or some such vehicle, the sort of car that must be sufficiently armor-plated to withstand an anti-tank grenade. I did not foresee that he would turn towards Finch's. He was hesitant and stiff while he inspected the shop sign. I watched him through the rain-spattered window, behind which I sat for hours each day at a desk covered with handwritten receipts. Old Chelsea loved those, under a poster which asked the patrons to support their local independent bookshop. Morning regulars hereabouts were mostly elderly ladies who enjoyed reading stories about cultured spinsters by the likes of Anita Bruckner or Sally Vickers, and empathizing fully, even though they were not spinsters themselves. Only a banker's widow can afford to live alone in this part of town, and some of these tough old birds had been multiply widowed by multiple bankers. They were my best customers. My foreignness was an advantage in their eyes, because they liked explaining England's ways to me, although they were now as lost in England as I was. They never bought books online, not because they disliked the internet, but because they did not even know that such a thing was possible. I was not a gentleman bookseller, although I made some efforts to resemble one. I slipped into Britain in the early 90s as a draft dodger with a PhD in English literature, a testimony to a platonic Anglophilia which I caught in my early 20s like a mystifying virus. My undistinguished doctorate on William Hazlitt was useless even back home, let alone on board Mothership UK, where PhDs in Englit are 2 a penny. I reached London as a refugee in a sea of refugees, part of a wave which was swelling in the war-torn Balkans and breaking on the hard but porous cliffs of Dover. My progress from there, my family's 2-room flat frozen in memory's Polaroid at the moment when the postman rang to deliver my call-up papers, to here involved quite a few lies. The first, but not the last of which, was my mother claiming that I had already escaped. Who knew that she had it in her to decline to obey the state? She did not know that she was riddled with cancer when she drove me to the Hungarian border in the dead of the following night. She said she would rather not see me again than see me with a gun in my hands. She had her wish. The parental deaths which eventually ensued and the subsequent sale of their miserable dwelling for the princely sum of €10,000, the only capital I had ever possessed, only cemented my ability to disengage from feeling, a knack which was as useful as my ability to disengage from my roots. I had also and always, I admit this freely, been a lucky bastard. When I obtained my British work permit, I landed in book sales accidentally. Christopher Finch was a gentleman bookseller, in that order. A gentleman all the time, and bookseller for an occasional hour or 2 when he bothered to turn up to check on me. He paid me miserably, but it was as much as he could afford, and often more than that. I started working for him in 1995. He had been widowed since 1987. I'm not even sure whether Christopher Finch was homo or heterosexual. Finch seemed to be the kind of otherworldly old boy for whom the concept of celibacy had been invented. He liked me, and I liked him. Our enterprise remained as half-hearted as the British weather, until the day Gorsky turned up with his piece of business. There was something so obvious in his solitary and slightly taciturn appearance that, almost from day one, I called him the Great Gorsky in my email exchanges with Finch. My boss was a keen writer of emails in spite of his fusty old Etonian technophobe facade. Emails, epistles as he called them, enabled him not to get out of bed when he did not feel like it. And he was not alone. We are talking about the aging population of an entire island in a mild stupor of post-imperial depression. My name is Gorsky. Roman Borisovich Gorsky, the Russian prince in Scottish Kashmir finally said, having inspected the shelves of Christopher Finch's for the best part of half an hour, here and there taking a volume down and leafing through it in a way which was at once careful and absent-minded. His English was a bit halting, but correct. I was wondering if I might have a quick chat with you. You speak Russian? He asked. After I stood up from my desk, I stammered something about understanding and reading. My mother tongue was similar enough. What do you read? Roman Borisovich interrupted, still in English. From Russia, I mean. Babel, Bunin, Bulgakov? He smiled at my row of B's. But Chekhov also. Tolstoy, of course. Having no idea about his literary tastes, I was trying to cover the field. Poetry? Yes, poetry too. Tsetaeva, Andrei Bieli, Akhmatova, Blok, the Silver Age in general, and Pushkin. Naturally, like everyone else, how can you not read Pushkin? How profound, Nicola, I thought with deepest sarcasm, even as I reeled off my all-too-obvious list. That, more or less, was it, our quick chat. The commission, which was to transform Finch's bookshop for the best part of 2 years, came seemingly as an afterthought. He was already almost out of the door when he mentioned the reason for his visit. Gorsky was building a house down the road, and we were to ensure that, on the day it was ready to occupy, it was furnished with the best library in London. Best private library in Europe. Not just any general library, but a library which would look as though Gorsky had acquired the books himself and read them over many years, or which would look as though he had inherited much of its stock from bookish ancestors. Gorsky wanted first editions of everything, including the Old Testament, and he wanted his copies in mint condition. "I will give you an allowance," he said, taking a long, narrow checkbook bound in maroon crocodile skin out of his coat pocket. He paused for a couple of seconds before writing out the sum of £250,000, payable to Christopher Finch Limited as a notice sellotape to the till directed him to do. His handwriting was both beautiful and illegible. The sum was clear enough. "Spend the money, and when you spend it, ask for more. Take 30% off for your time. But I want receipts for everything, down to the cheapest paperback. Does that seem reasonable?" His tone suggested that he was reasonable, indeed generous, but not a fool. After I had put the cheque stupidly, fumblingly inside the till and closed it, Gorsky gave a final little smirk and paused. "Art books?" he asked. "Yes, well, no, I mean yes to Russian art, avidly so indeed, but not in Russian, yet." That, for a change, was absolutely true. I had spent the best part of the previous year swatting up on Russian art, reading literally every book I could lay my hands on, because of Natalia Summerscale. "Good. Very good. I'd like my library to be able to enchant an art connoisseur." With that, he walked out of the door and into the waiting car. Natalia Summerscale was one of those willowy Russian women who were so tall and so beautiful that your heart missed a beat when she entered a room. She was impossibly elegant and made the gentlest of movements that carried a hint of some great disappointment. I was smitten by Natalia, although I knew that she was not only married, but clearly and conspicuously out of my league. For a long while I had no idea who Mr. Summerscale was. I was convinced that he must also be someone special to have been chosen by this woman, for she could have had any old billionaire she set her eyes on. Natalia engaged in no discernible form of work beyond the vague notion of bringing a retrospective exhibition of Ilya Kabakov's art to London. That at least was what she told me when she first came through the door of Christopher Finch's shop one February morning, wrapped in some expensive silver furs and smelling of mimosas. Over a few months thereafter, she used to turn up in the bookshop, say a polite hello, look around the art section, drop a few £50 notes on the desk, name a selection of titles, then leave. An hour or two after, the driver would turn up to collect her shopping. Her library on the subject must gradually have become quite sizable, yet weeks passed and her putative exhibition got no closer to fruition. Occasionally she was accompanied by her daughter, Daisy, a girl who was as blonde and willowy as the mother. I searched the name Summerscale on the internet, and I narrowed it down to a picture of a reasonably good-looking middle-aged man, a very English, strongly built man, like a former army officer. He was coming out of some charity bash at Claridge's. Natalia hung on his arm like a silk kite about to take off. I dropped Summerscale's name into conversations with my regulars and even one or two of my emails to Finch, and I got contradictory responses. "They live in that old hospital off Fulham Road," said one lady. "Spent over 2 years doing it up, drilling God alone knows how deep into the London soil." "Old money," said another. "Far too much money being splashed around to be old," said the third. No one seemed to know what Summerscale was doing in London now, but most suspected he acted as a kind of consigliere for the Russians. "Well, I knew his father, something or other in the British Embassy in Moscow after the war," said Finch. "Young Thomas Summerscale was called to the bar in the late 80s, went over to Moscow with an American consultancy, hooked up with a few people his father knew, who came back with trainloads of Russian money and that stunning Russian wife. We had an English wife before, somewhere in Gloucestershire." Could one be starstruck by someone who was not a star, but something more beautiful and rare? Natalia Summerscale was a complicated Fabergé egg, a priceless object I did not desire to possess. I tried to imagine the Russian place where she might have grown up, without much success. She might have been raised in a Siberian heroin den, or a lavish dacha on the outskirts of Moscow. Nothing fitted her otherworldly looks. She paid me next to no attention. I don't think she even realized that I was not English, not until that phone call many months later. "I was wondering if you have a copy of that book about Ilya Kabakov just published by Yale University Press?" I knew I was speaking to her, although she hadn't introduced herself. Did I have that Yale book? Did I not? I made sure we had every last title about conceptualist art. I had placed an order practically before the author had submitted his book proposal to Yale. "Oh, I am so glad. Mr. She hesitated. "Kimovich. Nicholas, I mean. Call me Nick, please." I stumbled, then paused, sensing another question in her hesitation. "I am Serbian. You know, from Serbia. Belgrade." "I do know where Serbia is, Mr. Kimovich. Even Belgrade. I visited it as a girl with my papa. What a lovely town it was." She hesitated for a brief moment when I suggested I would be happy to deliver the book myself. I was about to close the shop and I would welcome some fresh air and a walk. "Yes," she said. "Yes, why not?" I dutifully pretended to take the directions, although I had known it all for months. The place was called the Laurels. I walked the streets around it many times, looking over the high walls, across the manicured lawns. I tried to picture Natalia in the warm glow of a reading lamp, perhaps wearing a pair of tortoise-shell spectacles, but fantasizing about her day-to-day life was a bit like dreaming of a handcrafted yacht. I had none of the components needed to put the dream together. I had spied Natalia on the lawn in front of the Laurels only once. By then, I was already living practically across the road, a bit closer to the river, in the gatekeeper's cottage of a property whose main building was so majestic that it towered over the Laurels. It was a Baroque edifice which had once housed an army barracks, with a central dome as big as a cathedral's and miles of covered colonnades. It made Buckingham Palace look like an ungainly box by a roundabout. It had been surrounded for months by tall hoardings while it underwent a process of reconstruction which in its elaborateness seemed to dwarf anything that the Summerscales had done. The rent on my little cottage amounted to practically nothing, because I was happy to live next to the building site, and happy to confirm that I would leave with a month's notice as soon as the build was completed. I soon got used to the tremors which shook my new dwelling. I took to fragmentation like a fish to water. Contingency was my element, my natural habitat. At the Laurels, the bell echoed down some endless corridor as I stood between the CCTV cameras, which pointed at the top of my head while I tried discreetly to wipe my feet on a thick doormat. I never expected to see Thomas Summerscale in front of me. He materialized, barefoot, wearing an old Aran jumper and a pair of threadbare red corduroy trousers. He pushed a thick mop of hair off his face before he offered his hand in a handshake. "Well, good evening, Nicholas. I'm Tom Summerscale. Please come in. Natalia told me to expect you," somehow implying by his expression that she had told him much more than that he thought she and I were friends. Behind the double front door, pieces of artwork dotted the cavernous space. Summerscale stood there and smiled, allowing me moments to take it all in. He was now taking me through another double doorway, at the far end of which was Natalia, sitting on a blindingly white sofa, holding the hands of another woman and smiling at me in welcome. "Let me relieve you of that," Summerscale said. He took the book parcel from me and handed it to a maid who was standing to attention a couple of feet away. The woman next to Natalia looked extraordinary. She seemed considerably shorter, although not short herself, and she wore a tight red jersey dress which ended just above her knees. Underneath it, her body seemed constructed from a bundle of thick ropes tied tightly against each other, all muscle and bone and artificially tanned skin. It was obvious that she was wearing no bra, but also that she did not need one. I am talking about this woman's body because I have no idea of how to begin to describe her face. Her skin clung tightly to her high cheekbones. It seemed as though her skull was coming through. Yet she was bubbling with energy and somehow handsome with it all. "Gergana Pekarova," Natalia said and released Gergana's hands. Pekarova jumped to her feet and grasped both of mine simultaneously. Her handshake was firmer than Tom Summerscale's, and that is saying something. "Jerry is a famous Bulgarian gymnast, an Olympic gold medalist," Summerscale added as he disappeared off into the bowels of the house. "She is my personal trainer and my daughter's," Natalia explained. "And art advisor," Pekarova said with the faintest smile. She led me to an armchair which faced the sofa at an angle. Two maids wheeled in an enormous silver samovar. I stood up to leave, but Natalia touched my arm. "Stay," she said. She spoke softly, yet uttered an order nonetheless. Jerry Pekarova thanked the women in Bulgarian and started busying herself with platefuls of pastries and sandwiches, all the while asking questions about Finch's bookshop and me. Natalia listened, silent. When, in turn, I asked Pekarova about her life behind the Iron Curtain and her success as a gymnast, she responded half-heartedly, as though the topic bored her. Natalia turned away from me. "Let us not talk about communism," she said. "It is so boring. You sound so English, Mr. Kimovich. What Iron Curtain? I have never seen it. Have you? Let us talk of art and beautiful things." I had rehearsed Russian and Soviet art stories on the way there, hoping to impress Natalia, yet the only time she displayed a glimmer of curiosity about me was when, on our third porcelain cup of oolong tea, Pekarova and I started discussing Serbian tennis. "Djokovic," said the Bulgarian. "Your compatriot, no? A handsome boy. Sexy." Natalia suddenly stood up and took us both by the hand. "I have a great idea, Jerry," Why don't you and Mr. Kimovich take my Wimbledon tickets to see Djokovic play? I am sick of corporate hospitality, all those friends of Tom trying to be entertaining." She placed Jerry's hand over mine and held them thus. The Bulgarian threw an extraordinary smile in my direction. Her tanned cheeks sank under her cheekbones while her lips, covered by a thick layer of red lipstick, plumped up over her improbably white teeth. She looked like a female, or not so female, a version of Mick Jagger. Yet I had to admit that, although outlandish, she was far from unattractive. This was clearly matchmaking, yet there was something vaguely humiliating about the exercise. Was Natalia Summerscale putting me in my place by linking me, however tentatively, with her personal trainer? Daisy arrived carrying a folder of music sheets. I used the interruption as a cue to offer my apologies and leave. In the course of our surreal tea party, Natalia Summerscale had stood up from her sofa twice. Once to take Jerry Pekarova's hands and link them with mine, once to kiss the top of her daughter's head. And both times she held my gaze and said, "I am so happy, so happy." I did not believe it for a moment. I walked in and found myself in the middle of a landscape which looked like a First World War battlefield. I carried on along the improvised walkway that stretched over mounds of freshly dug earth. High above me, the Baroque dome suspended on a vast iron grid offered some protection from the rain. I turned away from the river to light a cigarette and realized that in doing so I had gained a direct line of sight at some distance into the upper floors of the Laurels. I heard a muffled cough and realized that someone was standing right beside me. I turned and immediately recognized the long face. "You know, young man, you shouldn't trespass like this. Didn't you see the warning?" I lived just over the wall. I nodded towards my little cottage. "We are next-door neighbors then, or soon will be. But not for long, perhaps. I am sure you know, I will need to put a roof over my boys' heads." He flicked his hand as if to dismiss me, but as he did so, I noticed 3 men in black leather jackets further down the colonnade step back into darkness. I heard the panting of dogs tugging on their leashes. I once dreamed of being a writer, but found that I was too lazy to put words on paper. Now I was determined to make Gorsky's library my literary masterpiece. Every volume in Gorsky's library would connect with every other one and create a perfect text. The collection would be a work of characterization as perfect as that of Julien Sorel or Ivan Karamazov. When he briefed me about my task, Gorsky spoke about it enchanting an art connoisseur. I aimed to accomplish more. I wanted to imagine a woman falling in love with him simply by walking through his library. That love, too, would be my creation. I scoured auction catalogues for the rarest books and manuscripts, even ancient scrolls. Then there were the latest glossy volumes with high-resolution photographs, which I purchased purely to indulge Natalia Summerscale, should she ever set foot in her neighbor's library. My collection, Gorsky's collection, was taking shape in its expensive, humidity-controlled storage facility as it awaited the day when the shelves, still to be constructed out of acres of rare wood, were ready to carry it in its full magnificence. Easter came late. It was almost May, and one of those rare years when both the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic holiday fell on the same day as Passover. Christopher Finch suddenly declared that I must take the day off. I hadn't had a Sunday off in 10 years, he argued, and he was having his mother over. He needed some time away from her, or he would go mad. There was no one and nothing I wanted to see, and I hardly wanted to stay at home reading books when I could do that more comfortably at work with fewer distractions. I had nothing better to do than join a procession of worshippers somewhere for a bit of people watching, choral music, and incense-fumed aromatherapy. Easter is the main holiday in the Orthodox calendar in every sense, not just in the narrow theological one of the Christmas-dominated West, and the Russian church gets so packed that the congregation spills out into the surrounding streets. There are hundreds of families with children carrying baskets of elaborately painted eggs or bringing their kulich cakes for a blessing on trays held high in front of them. I did not expect to see Natalia Summerscale, and I assumed Gorsky wouldn't be there either. If he believed in God at all, I suspected that he worshipped in a different kind of temple. I was about to take the final corner before the familiar Romanesque portico when I spotted Natalia and Jerry just ahead, holding Daisy's hands. All three wore white. Jerry carried a basket of eggs painted in red, gold, and silver. When they turned into the church, I walked straight ahead and across Hyde Park and Bayswater and then up Portobello Road. For a long moment after we collided, and as we both apologized, I did not recognize him. Tom Summerscale was wearing a hideous blue tracksuit and a black beanie hat pulled low over his forehead. He looked like someone in the midst of a strenuous jog, but it was an odd corner of London to be jogging in if you lived in Chelsea. He laughed, unfazed. He had taken notice of me perhaps only because of the look of astonishment on my face. "I'm just stopping for some oysters and porter round the corner. Why not join me?" he said, as though there was nothing unusual about the situation. I joined him out of curiosity. Something told me that, like me, he was not a man with many friends. I was wearing what passes for my Sunday best. He was dressed like a roofer on his way home from his day's shift, but his public school ruddiness and his posh baritone were impossible to disguise. I half listened to his insights into Russian politics, becoming alert only when Natalia's name was mentioned. This part of his ramblings, although much quieter, was worth paying attention to because he was surprisingly frank. They had been married for just over 7 years. Natalia had abandoned her studies of art history in St. Petersburg to come to Britain with him. Summerscale was urging her to continue. She was reluctant. It was as though all she had ever wanted was to go west, he said, but now that she was here, she couldn't quite figure out who she was supposed to be. It felt as though he was asking for some piece of advice I couldn't give. We sat in silence for a while. "I have an appointment, Nick, old boy." Summerscale eventually looked at his watch. "Why don't you come with me? I'll drive you back afterwards. It'll only take a minute, and you'll enjoy seeing old Mardy." We cut through the no-man's land of boarded-up shops and scruffy B&Bs in the shadow of the Westway. Summerscale rang at the door of an unremarkable terraced house. A chubby little Maghrabian man finally opened the door. He was wearing a tracksuit almost identical to Summerscale's, and over it a long burnous with a pointed hood dropping halfway down his stout back. "Mr. Summerscale," he said, looking at me. "I expected you an hour ago." "Nick, a friend," said Summerscale. "Mahmoud Alawi, my accountant." We shook hands. The suggestion that Summerscale's accountant would look like this and live in a house like this was preposterous, but I let it pass. A woman appeared in the lobby behind the man, a brunette in her late 30s. She was dressed in a tight silk dress printed with irises. Her skin was like porcelain, and she showed acres of it. I couldn't take my eyes off her chest. Alawi frowned and pushed her into one of the side doors. She gave a little yelp, but stayed out of sight. He made no attempt to explain her presence. He took a padded envelope from a deep pocket in his cloak and handed it to Summerscale. As we weaved our way back to Chelsea, he started talking about Natalia again. Alongside the idea of the gallery, he had suggested staging a one-off exhibition of Russian art in aid of Siberian orphanages. He talked of it as though I was already fully up to date. I wondered if she had misled him about me in some way, to create an impression that she was doing something concrete about her gallery or her exhibition. I did not expect to become Summerscale's drinking buddy after that outing, but he had different ideas. Some days later, he stopped by Finch's to invite me to one of those pretentious new restaurants in Soho. I assumed that I was part of some renewed matchmaking plot involving Jerry, but it was the prospect of Natalia's presence that made me put on my best suit. The restaurant was heaving. It took a moment to see Summerscale at a table flanked by two women, Mrs. Alawi and someone looking very much like her but with more makeup. In their cheerful, tight dresses with their elaborate hairdos and carefully manicured nails, they looked like a couple of secretaries on an evening out with their patrician boss. Summerscale introduced them as Janice and her sister Sal. They were two of the most cheerfully vulgar creatures I have ever had the luck to meet, but they knew a great deal about food and wine. Every now and then Janice would lift a forkful to Summerscale's mouth, pursing her lips like a mother moving her child onto solid food. He relished the attention and shot a quick wink in my direction each time he took a mouthful. I was too baffled by the spectacle to be outraged. All the while, her right hand tinkled and jingled with bracelets, while her left, decorated with several large rings, rested high on Summerscale's thigh. Her sister leaned towards me, hitching up the pink straps of her bra and smiling coquettishly. I pretended not to notice. Our Tommy bought Janice a little flat in Covent Garden. Cutest little flat. Place for all of us to have a little fun. She pressed my hand close to her breast. I'm going to disappear for a moment, Summerscale interrupted. Look after the ladies, Nick. The moment he left, Janice turned to me and said, So how do you know our Tom then, Nicky darling? Before I had any time to answer, she said, Look at him, here he comes, quick as a flash, my sweet boy. Summerscale was brimming with newfound energy. He had already paid the bill, and soon we were walking towards Covent Garden. The two sisters were hanging on Summerscale's arms and teetering on the high heels of their strappy sandals, while their manicured toes shone white and plump in the glare of the street lights, like rows of tiny new potatoes. It was Sal, by now the drunker of the two women, who leant towards me. How do you know our Tommy then, Nick, my love? Sal repeated her sister's question. Oh, I'm a friend of... What a jolly place that was, Summerscale said, cutting me off. Well, we must do it more often. Oh, the Ice Maiden, Jan laughed. You from Siberia too, then, Nicky dear? She seemed to find the notion hilarious. Shut up, Jan. Summerscale pushed her quite forcefully. She teetered, stunned out of her drunkenness for a moment, but not enough to make me think this was the first time. That Jan Alawi was Summerscale's mistress, there was no doubt. They looked disappointed for a moment when I bid my farewell at the top of St. Martin's Lane and refused a nightcap. Leaving me to look after both girls, you schmuck, he said. Then, Switching to Russian. I guess that much. You limp Serbian dick. It's my wife you dream of shafting, isn't it? He did not look angry at all. He looked like someone who would cope without me. Jerry Pekarova embraced me as though we were the oldest of friends. I haven't seen Mrs. Summerscale in such a long while. Is she here? Oh, you must be joking. Natalia coming to Russian party? A reminder of all the things she wants to forget, she says. You know it's a Gorsky party, don't you? She continued. I wouldn't have missed it if I had to kill to get in. Last year, he hired one of those huge clubs in Pall Mall and had the facade covered in trailing orchids. Another time, he flew people on private jets to Italy and took them sailing on his yacht. Oh, I misled you when I said he took them. He stayed in the Highlands playing golf in the rain. They say he watches his own parties via webcam. You get used to the money in this town, she added. But Gorsky's money is beyond all dreams of wealth. No one knows exactly how he made it. Some say oil, some say weapons. Who knows, Nick? Who cares? She produced her business card and tucked it into my trouser pocket, beamed at me, and walked away. Later, as I walked back towards Kensington Gore, the familiar silver limousine drew up in front of me. A man sitting next to the driver jumped out and held the back door open. Mr. Kimovich, if you please. Gorsky patted the seat next to him. I hope you enjoyed the party. He nodded towards the screen in front, which was broadcasting scenes from the place I had just left. I have never seen its like. Did you meet any friends? No. Unless you count my boss and Jerry Pekarova, I said. Ah, the gymnast, Gorsky interrupted. I am old enough to remember her as a young girl, gold medal around her neck. She was so pretty. Isn't London strange, the way it brings us back together? You are from Belgrade, you said. I was often in Belgrade in the 90s. Difficult times. I left long before the worst. Who could have guessed it? I was cautious. I hardly wanted to cross him inadvertently. Anyone could, he countered. The second the wall went down in Berlin, it was clear. Your nation is a victim of the Cold War, Mr. Kimovich. Much misunderstood. Like mine. At least mine can stand up for itself. We drove past tall Victorian facades. Occasionally he asked the driver to slow down so that he could take in a portico or a row of high windows. I love architecture, he said. Remember that when you're buying books for me. Nothing too technical, though. I am a mathematician by training. Mathematics is closer to poetry than to other sciences, perhaps, or to philosophy, pure abstraction, like money, you might say. He did not expect a reply. Gorsky searched in the glove compartment built into the wide armrest between us and produced a small box which he handed over, snapping it open. A medal rested on a dark satin cushion. Have a look. See what it says at the back. I lifted a familiar white cross. To R.B. Gorsky, from the grateful Serbian nation, read the engraving in fine Cyrillic calligraphy. He took the medal from my hand, examined it for a moment as though he was about to share its story, but instead laid it carefully back into its box, which he closed again with another soft snap. At some point in my life, I ceased to care about its course sufficiently to take any decisive action. I disengaged. I made no virtue of escaping the Yugoslav wars by a whisker. Had my mother not refused my call-up papers, had I been mobilized, I would have gone to shoot and be shot at. I realize that this is a strange way of explaining how or why I started seeing Jerry Pekarova. I wasn't actively attracted, but I didn't mind her company. She must have sensed that I was the sort of man who did not mind doing as he was told, particularly if it involved no hard work. We bumped into each other in Waitrose on the King's Road. Her shopping basket contained a box of sprouting broccoli and a bottle of vodka. Mine, an Indian meal for one. "Nikita," she gurgled. "We must get together again, Nikita. Go out, dance, have fun." So we got together. We went to a cheap Bulgarian grill, then an expensive Bulgarian club. At 4 a.m., she took me home. She took me. I'm not a vastly promiscuous man, but I have had enough lovers to appreciate Jerry's love-making skills. We awoke at midday and rested on her enormous bed, listening to church bells. "We are friends with benefits, aren't we, Nikki?" she said, with that self-congratulatory smile she adopted whenever she appropriated an English cliché. She laughed when I told her I thought she was a lesbian when we first met. "Oh, perhaps I am too. Perhaps I like you because you are such a girl's blouse." I stared at the ceiling, composing my shopping list for Gorsky. I had just acquired pristine first editions of À la Recherche and Ulysses and a rare Soviet Samizdat typescript of Dr. Zhivago. "A kopeck for your thoughts?" Jerry stood in the doorway, wrapped in a white toweling robe. "Gorsky," I said. "I wonder why he wants the library." She curled next to me and sighed. "Do you think I stand a chance? I know they like 16-year-olds, people like him, but they must get bored. Gorsky looks like a cold fish to me, but he's not married, apparently. A woman can get used to loneliness inside marriage, given other compensations. What do you think, Nikki?" I couldn't imagine any other woman weighing her chances with the richest man in London so openly and so soon after she had made love to me. But with Jerry, I was almost charmed by her lack of pretense. I wasn't sure if I was doing him or her a favor when I invited her to join me at the opera. The tickets were a present from Gorsky. I had just managed to secure a first edition of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin dedicated to Prince Dolgoruki. Gorsky was so delighted to have the volume that I was granted a rare glimpse into his personal life. "A woman who means a great deal to me knows still, perhaps, the whole of Onegin by heart." He hesitated for a moment, on the brink of saying more, but changed his mind, and proceeded to tell me how he had donated £10 million to the Royal Opera on condition that they close the season with Eugene Onegin. We gathered in one of those grand hotel restaurants in Mayfair. The waiter was still fussing with my coat when Jerry made her entrance. She was wearing a tight silver dress which made her look like a mermaid. Her teeth looked even more brilliantly white than usual, because her skin had bronzed considerably since when I saw her the day before. She looked more like a transvestite than ever. The effect was somewhere between stunning and ridiculous. "Roman Borisovich Gorsky, Gergana Pekarova." Gorsky stood up and kissed her outstretched hand. He spoke in Bulgarian, with a soft Russian accent, but fluently nonetheless. "Oh, I lived in Sofia for 3 or 4 years, he explained when she expressed surprise on hearing him address her in her mother tongue. "You would have been in Germany by then." Jerry did not seem taken aback by his knowledge of the details of her defection. He continued to turn his glass of vodka without drinking any. "And what do you do in London?" Jerry asked. "I'm doing up a house by the Thames," Gorsky said. "And you?" "I work as a personal trainer and a nutritionist." "Oh," said Gorsky. "I need both. I take only one client at a time. It would take a lot to tempt me to leave my client at the moment." "I can offer a lot," Gorsky said. They both seemed deadly serious. It was difficult to know what exactly they were negotiating. "My client is a very distinguished lady. I am devoted to her. You put me in a difficult situation, Mr. Gorsky. I am more comfortable with women. Professionally, I mean." Her manicured hand now hovered above his lapel. Under the table, her foot was climbing up my shin and along my femur at an angle which only an Olympic gold medalist could accomplish. As Gorsky took his place in the corner of his box at Covent Garden and started flicking through the program, I became aware how famous he actually was. People stared while pretending not to look. He may have been the most discreet of London oligarchs. No Premier League football clubs to his name, no high-profile divorces. But his parties, despite or because of his persistent absence, and the palace for which I was equipping the library assured him regular appearances in the gossip columns. The absence of a personal story became a story in its own right. Was he gay, perhaps? Why was he so determinedly alone? Members of the choir dressed as Russian peasants gradually filled the stage, and then the song of the field labourers rose towards the gods. I cast a furtive glance towards my companions. Jerry's eyes were fixed on the stage, but I could already sense her restlessness. Gorsky was reclining, half hidden by the shadow of the red velvet which draped our box. His eyes were slowly welling with tears. Slav soul, I thought with a dash of unjustified mockery. I had assumed that he was staring into the darkness above people's heads, but then an instinct made me follow the line of his gaze across the auditorium towards the row of boxes opposite. Directly in his sights was a group of young men and women, city types. In the smaller box to the left, there were two people, a man and a woman. The man's face was hidden by the program. The faint blue light emanating from behind it suggested that he was examining his mobile phone. The woman was wearing a simple black dress, with no jewelry to offset its severity. There was no doubt about it. Unlike most of the rest of us, she was there for the music. Her familiar, beautiful Russian face was unmistakable. "Welcome to Hesperos, Mr. Kimovich," read a card attached to a glossy silk bag waiting on my bed. Inside was a collection of goods one might need on a Greek island, if one was a high-class rent boy who liked to travel extremely light. Toiletries, suntan lotion, 2 pairs of swimming trunks, one minute and black, one baggy and printed in fetching blue and white stripes, flip-flops, and a pair of wraparound sunglasses. Everything came in my size, and from the kind of luxury brands I considered an utter waste of money. Gorsky was nowhere to be seen, not on that first evening, not the second, nor even the third. I lounged in a hammock, took a couple of scuba diving classes, and read thrillers from a small library in my bungalow. On my last evening, there was a barbecue party. Small boats brought guests from yachts moored across the archipelago. There were dozens of stunning young men and women who drank champagne, took cocaine, and swam in the red glow of the dying sun. There was music from somewhere behind the trees, live, discreet music. One of the young women gestured at me. I followed her along a path until we came to a low stone bench sheltered by a wild jasmine. She lifted the hem of her white shirt dress. I nodded in consent, like an idiot at a fish stall. It was extremely exciting in a surreal kind of way, beautiful and apocalyptic at the same time because of the sheer decadence of our coupling. "Mustache," she said afterwards in a cut-glass English accent. She blew me a kiss as she left. She did not seem like a prostitute to me, not at all, yet, honestly, whenever I entered Gorsky's world, I lost my bearings. Back in London, the drizzle was as persistent as when I left. "How was Hesperos?" Gorsky asked. "How does one buy an island like that?" I responded with a question. "Just curious, I am not thinking of getting one." He smiled. "It came with the Caragiannis portfolio. The shipbuilder, you remember? In the 1990s, I spent much of my time in Sofia. It's a claustrophobic town. I had to escape every now and then. I was trading with Serbia in those days, sanction busting. You remember? Your people were suffering needlessly, and the West, well, you know all about that. I had this ideal of helping people. What else can you do with your life that makes as much sense?" I had no idea what he was talking about. He was clearly spinning a myth out of shady mafia deals. He pulled a slim card case out of his pocket and showed me a photograph inside its flap. A picture of himself, looking younger, next to a woman I recognized as one of my country's most eminent surgeons, a former Minister of Health. She had famously built one of the most modern children's hospitals in Europe, with an anonymous donation. In the picture, she and Gorsky were standing in front of an Orthodox chapel with a distinctive red and yellow facade. "The Rojewski Memorial Chapel in southern Serbia," Gorsky explained. "Remember Vronsky from Anna Karenina? Tolstoy used the story of a real man, Count Nikolai Rojewski, who fought the Turks in Serbia in the 1870s and died there. Vronsky was my kind of hero. 1 part Pan-Slavism, 2 parts Death Wish, if you will. I had a similar story back in Russia. A woman to forget. But instead of dying in battle, I got to deal with old Vasilis Karagiannis, and I received Hesperos in part payment." I watched the streets of London unfurl past us. I never knew what I was allowed to ask, what was appropriate. "Have you ever been married?" I finally ventured. He turned towards me, threw me a long, searching look, and ignored my question. We crossed London in silence. We came to a stop in front of my gatehouse. The driver was already out and walking around to hold open the door for me when I had an idea so obvious that it was baffling why it hadn't occurred to me before. Halfway out, I turned and asked, "Have you ever met Natalia Summerscale? She lives opposite, a Russian woman." His face froze for a moment. "Summerscale? I know of no Summerscale. What kind of a name is that?" 2 days later, I ran into Jerry Pekarova in the same supermarket on the King's Road. "Hey, Nikita, I was just thinking that I can't face shopping tonight. Join me at the Eagle for salad and glass of wine?" "I have a story to tell. I was given a special task, you could say." Jerry started the tale over a plateful of lentils and goat's cheese, and ended it in her bed. The next day I walked down the King's Road trying to process the story Jerry had told me. Gorsky had shared it with her precisely so that she could ask me a favor, a silly and childish favor, like a plot people might get involved in on the teenage dating scene, or so it would have been, but for the complexity and costliness of its proposed execution. When he was sacked from his university post, Gorsky briefly traded in Chinese toys, buying in China and selling in Russia. But toys were boring, a small-time training ground. His move into the Balkans was encouraged by the legendary mayor of Volgograd, Nikolai Semyonovich Volkov, recently retired but still living in the town and well-connected everywhere from East Berlin to Shanghai. Gorsky was invited to Volgograd. He became, for a while, Volkov's sixth child. He befriended his adoptive siblings. The youngest, Natalia, was away from home reading for an art history degree in St. Petersburg. Gorsky was 12 years older than her. He was too old to be love-struck. Yet, love-struck he was, the moment he set eyes on her baccalaureate photograph. She was still in her school uniform, a coup de foudre, Jerry said. Natalia turned up in Volgograd, looking even more beautiful than her picture. Gorsky was so determined to marry her that he spoke to her father long before he had spoken to her. She must have encouraged him, nonetheless. One evening, he dropped on a bended knee and produced a small box out of his top pocket. Natalia pushed it away with her hand, trying to prevent the inevitable opening, and whispered, "No, I can't. I am too young." He wouldn't take no for an answer. Jerry had no idea what exactly Natalia promised, but Gorsky had no doubt that she had left an opening, that she would eventually be his. He would wait. He would make money. He promised her that he would return when she graduated and propose again. He kept his word. He returned to Volgograd some 3 years later only to find that, according to his interpretation of their agreement, she hadn't kept hers, that she had married an Englishman and left the country. He was so convinced that she was in love with him, and him alone, that the Englishman was nothing but a convenient passport, that he decided to make his millions and offer her another chance to be his wife. "Why do you think he's building that place? He thinks that one day soon, when it's all ready, she will just cross the road, leave a summer scale behind like one leaves a restaurant after a pleasant meal, and be his. In fact, he wants you to arrange a meeting in your little bookshop in exactly 2 weeks' time. The anniversary of his original proposal. She was 19 when they first met. She is 30 now. But she is as beautiful as ever, and he loves her as much as that first day." What Gorsky did not know, what nobody knew except Natalia and Jerry was now telling me, is that she had loved him for the last 9 out of those 11 years without any plan to ever become his wife. They'd had another encounter when she was 21, a meeting he had neglected to mention when he told his story to Jerry. Natalia had been on the books of an escort agency in St. Petersburg for several months when it happened. In those murky days, Leningrad's cafes were full of pimps pretending to be scouts for modeling agencies, and a young woman as beautiful as Natalia was an obvious target. Out of rebellion, out of her own thirst for experience and money, but at first simply because she was naive, she accepted engagements in expensive hotels. "Don't look so shocked, Nikita," Jerry said. "I'm not a complete stranger to the business myself. When powerful men stop buying sex, powerful women will stop selling it. I have never been sure precisely, but I think she met Tom on an assignment too." What is the exact difference between selling your body and marrying for money? Anyway, she had one rule, that her clients must be foreign, not Russian. She hardly wanted some crusty old friend of her dad turning up. One night, someone made a mistake. She was called to a hotel room expecting an Israeli businessman celebrating an arms deal. When the door opened, she saw Gorsky. He said absolutely nothing, asked no questions, and she did her job. She left his room with 10,000 euro, in love, and convinced that he would never want to see her again. I finally reacted. You must be joking. You are the last person I'd have expected to fall for such sentimental rubbish, Gergana. Men who make that much money are brutal. They don't fall in love like that. Women who work as escorts and marry people like Tom Summerscale don't pine in secret for some long-lost Prince Charming. You know nothing, Jerry said. Money has nothing to do with anything. You make very little money. You feel very little. You are fine. You are a bolter, Nicola, aren't you? And you fancy Natalia because it's a form of running away, like being infatuated with a Hollywood star. But you should do this for Roman Gorsky. He pays your rent. I wondered how to engineer an invitation to Natalia Summerscale. I knew something about her husband that Gorsky would no doubt love to hear, but I did not want to be part of any sordid revenge plot. My walk home was at an end, and my head was buzzing. I wondered if Gorsky had planned it all, exactly as it was unfolding. Long before I met him. Long before he entered Finch's that first time. I may have been nervous, but I was not half as nervous as Gorsky seemed to be. He paced about, shooting restless glances here and there. She was half an hour late, coming on foot, breathless and apologetic, her coat over her arm, wearing a shirt of golden silk over a pair of green velvet trousers. "Oh, you've had a refit. This is lovely, absolutely lovely." "And wait till you see the art section," I said, suddenly scared as I guided her towards the back of the shop. I saw Gorsky stand up from his chair and take a step towards her. She looked back at me for less than a split second, startled, then gave a little animal squeal. I followed her in, but she turned towards me and dismissed me with a single flick of her hand. For the next half an hour, I stared at the newly installed security screen under the desk while trying not to look. It was difficult to guess the mood of the conversation. If his face was expressionless, hers was even more so. Finally, Gorsky stood up, and then she did, and they walked towards each other, and he held her for several long moments. Then they walked out of the room. When they reached the till where I was sitting, Natalia looked happier than I had ever seen her before. "Dearest Nicholas, I am so glad to have come here today. Would you be able to accompany us? Roman wants to show me the exhibition space he's creating. It will take 45 minutes at most. I have to be at Daisy School at 6. I need to have your company. Please." By the time we reached the barracks, Gorsky's architect was there and waiting. She took the three of us straight to the dome. Even at ground level, the vantage point provided amazing views south across the Thames and north towards the Laurels and the rest of Chelsea. If Natalia looked happy when she left Finch's, she now seemed transported. Gorsky stared at Natalia's face as though bewitched. If I weren't jealous, I might have found it almost funny. And I was indescribably, immeasurably jealous. Not of the idea, which now seemed certain, that he might soon have this woman forever. Not of the building, nor of the money he possessed, but of his capacity to feel. It was Natalia who invited Gorsky and me to Daisy's school play. Daisy delivered her lines with the poise of the young Queen Elizabeth. When the play ended, Jerry materialized from somewhere with a little girl in tow. Gorsky was transformed in an instant. The child curtsied and looked at him. Their faces spread into instantaneous wide smiles. She raised her arms towards him, and he lifted her as high as he could. Natalia looked at Jerry, and Jerry looked at me, as though we were all witnessing some kind of miracle. "You are not needed anymore," Jerry whispered in my ear as she pulled me away. "A summer scale had to fly to Zurich this afternoon until tomorrow night. I have just told Natalia." In my little dwelling, which Gorsky now owned, I prepared to retire to bed. As I drew the curtains, the lawn in front of the laurels was lit so brightly that my ceiling was bathed in a greenish, reflected light. In the middle of it stood Natalia and Gorsky, kissing. I was startled out of my morning reading by a ring on the door. The woman introduced herself as Siobhan MacDonald. She was working on a series of articles. "My Russian Neighbors" was the running title. "Have you ever met Roman Gorsky?" She came straight to the point. "Not really," I said. "He's transforming the Chelsea Yeomanry Barracks, a Grade 1 listed building, into a private palace." "Should I be worried?" I asked. "Doesn't all this work disturb you? Living next door, as you do?" "Not really. I'm never at home. I work all day." "Isn't it strange to want so much space?" "Money needs space, I guess. This doesn't trouble me. If it did, I'd try to earn more than I do." "And how much is that?" I named the sum. She took a photograph. Her article, when it appeared some days later, had a picture of me, smiling, and a view of several large cranes in the window behind. The caption read, "Slav Labor." Her portrait of Gorsky was presented as a classic tale of rags to riches. Gorsky was born wretchedly poor. His father, Boris Moiseyevich Gorsky, a printer, died when the boy was 7. His mother, Elizaveta Alexandrovna Stern, had worked as a guard at the Hermitage well into the 1990s, even as her son made his first billions. Whether the PR effort at establishing good neighborly relations had anything to do with my interview or not, a few days after the piece appeared, I was alarmed to see Tom Summerscale and a small group of elderly citizens of Chelsea standing by my front door, about to embark on a tour of the barracks. They were led by the architect and Gorsky himself, escorted not so discreetly by a couple of his bodyguards. One of them approached me and said, "Mr. Gorsky asks if you would like to join us." The tour came to an end, and one of the elderly couples walked over to Gorsky. "Dear Mr. Gorsky, this was absolutely fascinating. If you're not in a hurry, it would be lovely if you could join us for tea with Mr. Summerscale." "Sir Michael and Lady Leighton." Gorsky reluctantly introduced the couple. It was clear that Summerscale had no idea who they were, although they evidently knew him. "A cup of tea would be most excellent." Gorsky turned to Summerscale. "Would you care to join us?" One of the bodyguards gave me a brief nod before he followed the group. No one else said goodbye. Some weeks later, Finch received an invitation to CFG Finch Esquire and Companion. So I went along. The meal was to be followed by a charity auction for the benefit of Lady Leighton's Donkey Sanctuary on Exmoor. Every item to be auctioned had been donated by Gorsky. Each one, from Meissen porcelain to Lalique glass, would feature a donkey. I was seated at one of the outer tables in the room, with Finch, his old friend Victor, who was a fixer for Russian exiles, Jerry, a buxom Swedish friend of hers, and a taciturn elderly Russian woman who had once worked for the BBC World Service. Jerry and I had little conversation. She was optimistic about the way things were unfolding between Natalia and Gorsky, but could neither whisper nor say much within earshot of so many others. She was hoping that any transfer, the word she used to refer to the expected developments, as though Natalia was a footballer, would apply to her as well. At the table in the centre of the room, next to Lady Daphne Leighton, sat Gorsky. Next to him, in his tailored dinner jacket, Summerscale looked even more like a rugby player than in his usual day clothes. Natalia was in a white silk dress. As usual, she wore no jewellery. When she spotted me, she waved and threw me a big, warm smile, the kind I first saw on her face after her meeting with Gorsky. Summerscale, looking flushed with drink, came over to say hello to Victor, who stood up and introduced the Swede. Summerscale immediately pulled up a chair between them and started flirting with her. Perhaps because I kept trying to avoid Summerscale's insistent gaze, he addressed me directly. "Young Serb, have you forgotten us? Why, you used to drop by to see my lady wife and our lovely friend Jerry here. Now we hardly ever see you. Have you three little sloughs fallen out with each other? Or do you perhaps still come when I am not around?" He let out a vulgar, throaty laugh. "I wouldn't worry about Nick if I were you, old boy," Victor chipped in. He turned towards the central table so pointedly that all of us followed his gaze. Just at that moment, Natalia was saying something to Gorsky. Although they were seated at least a foot apart, their faces were lit with a desire which was impossible to mistake. Summerscale's face turned deep crimson. He walked noisily back to his table. Gorsky glanced at his bodyguards. The room went quiet. "Sorry to interrupt your conversation, dear boy," Summerscale hissed loudly, then paused. Gorsky waited. In a flash, Summerscale seemed to change his mind. Slumping into his chair, he laughed and said, "Never mind. Never mind." He switched over to Russian, but still loud and clear. "Keep your dirty yid paws off my wife. Do you hear me?" Natalia's expression, frozen as she awaited Gorsky's response, confirmed that I understood the remark. I saw Gorsky look at her, then at Summerscale, then at the bodyguards, then back at her, weighing a decision. Summerscale's lips stretched into a forced smile. Gorsky still stared at Natalia. Some kind of wordless conversation was taking place between them. A team of waiters entered with dessert plates covered with silver cloches. The maître d'hôtel looked at Gorsky for a sign. Gorsky nodded. As the guests started moving towards the ballroom for the auction, I used the moment to slip away. In St. James's Park, a lone busker was playing. I stood for a long while, listening to the music. I was 13, when I first knew I was a Jew. I was startled to hear Gorsky beside me. Someone used that same word about me at school, and I did not even respond. I thought they were talking about someone else. My parents were communists and atheists. I am hardly going to hide my Jewishness, but I am Russian first. When I marry, I am not going to expect my wife or my child to convert to Judaism. If she should expect me to marry in church, even to be baptized myself, I would consider it. He spoke as though he was rehearsing an argument. That seems most unlikely, I interrupted. Particularly given her divorce? It was just convenience. Her arrangement with the Englishman, he is so unimportant that I can't even feel angry with him. We'll forget all of that. I'm not sure why Gorsky waited, but wait he did. What are 2 months compared to 10 years? During those 2 months, his building project was slowly completed. There was a week when they kept bringing in dozens of chandeliers with long pendulous diamond drops. In due course, the gardeners moved in, delivering huge, mature trees, dotting alcoves with antique sculptures, while rolling out sections of rich green turf like expensive carpets. My turn came too. I abandoned my desk at Finch's to start moving the books into the library, a vast hall which, through a couple of hidden doorways, connected the private wings with the gallery space. My commute to work became very short. I crossed the gravel path towards Chateau Gorsky each morning. I unpacked boxes and placed the titles in the order I had been planning for many months. Some went on open shelves, others were displayed in sealed glass cabinets with controlled temperature and humidity. Framed in a little mahogany box, with an ornate lid inlaid with Siberian gemstones, was the manuscript which represented the collector's Koh-i-Noor, Pushkin's poem of undying love for Anna Kern. The very sheet which the poet tucked between the pages of Eugene Onegin when he presented the book to Anna on the day of their parting. I overheard Gorsky recite the opening verse to Natalia when they met at Finch's. It was, and even then, by virtue of citation, the only time I heard him address her with an informal you. I was in the barracks early one morning, scrolling through one of the many lists of titles, when a removal van arrived. A couple of burly Russians carried in Gorsky's personal possessions: files, a baby grand piano, an old-fashioned record player, then clothes in zippered covers, shoes, boots, several hat boxes. I stood and watched. Gorsky's personal stuff amounted cumulatively to less than my own. Compared to everything that had already been delivered to the house, this was positively ascetic. Then the familiar, majestic car arrived, and the man himself stepped out with a bottle of champagne. I was soon summoned by a solitary butler to an enormous and, but for the piano already installed in the corner, completely empty room. Gorsky approached me with 2 glasses. "You are my housewarming party," he said. "To the move," I responded, taking a sip of a grande cuvée. By then, I had come to know the difference. "I hope I'll get a guided tour when it's furnished." "Oh, that will wait a little while longer. You need a woman's touch to furnish a woman's home." I invited him to view his library. We started from the large alcove which housed the Romantics. He seemed to me to be one of them, in spite of the way in which he spoke of his narrow, mathematical mind. I held up a copy of Goethe's Faust, which used to belong to Shelley. I reeled off amusing anecdotes which involved the Brits, the French, and the Germans, and I occasionally invoked the Russians, as if to suggest that the best that Europe had ever produced was now in his possession. I was hoping that he would appreciate the story his collection, our collection, was telling, that he would acknowledge that, like Cyrano, I had created something that would, if our Roxanne or anyone else bothered to look, go on seducing on his behalf. Yet he followed my explanations absent-mindedly, exclaiming, well done," intermittently, glancing across the road towards the laurels more often than at the shelves. Even when I opened that precious edition of Onegin, the one he had been so keen on acquiring, he barely looked at it. Gorsky started disappearing for days at a time. He was in the country or away on business. Moscow, Zurich, Berlin, Jerusalem, Almaty. On the mornings of some of those nights he spent in residence, I could smell a woman's scent on the corridors, a faint, powdery smell of mimosas. Natalia's smell. I found a pair of sunglasses on one of the shelves. In the evenings, I looked out but saw only lights going on or off. I heard music, old Russian waltzes, simple tunes. I suspected that Gorsky played them himself. The second May bank holiday brought an unseasonal and short-lived hot spell. One Saturday morning, Tom Summerscale unexpectedly decided to make his peace. Rumors about his overwrought behavior and his insult to Gorsky were not going down well in his business circles. He had too much capital invested in Russia not to care. He sent a note of apology to Gorsky. Then, in a further gesture of contrition, he instructed Jerry to invite Gorsky and me to his rooftop swimming pool. Gorsky even more unexpectedly accepted. The pool was small and secluded within the walls of a former hospital chapel on the top floor. It had an ingenious retractable glass roof, and beyond the walls it was surrounded by a roof garden modelled on the Alhambra. Only Daisy and I swam. Natalia reclined under a white parasol. She was leafing through some glossy magazine too thick to be held up, so she rested it on a boyish hip and faced away from the rest of us. She must have been aware of the strangeness of the situation, and her body responded by pretending it wasn't there. Jerry sunbathed in a tiny crimson bikini. Gorsky and Summerscale sat side by side and sipped their whiskies in silence. Summerscale in striped swimming trunks with white trails of sun cream on his wide shoulders. Gorsky in jeans and a linen shirt. An awkward straw hat hid the upper half of his face. He was sunning only his bare feet. Then Daisy invited us all to play a board game. Her mother declined and disappeared inside, promising that she would be back in a minute, but did not return. Jerry followed her in a bit later. Gorsky, Summerscale, and I indulged the girl. It was a sort of snakes and ladders involving miniature plastic rabbits and a huge red die. We slowly relaxed into the simple rhythm of the game. Then Daisy cast the die and it rolled off the table together with the board. She reached below to collect the figures and squealed. "Look, everyone, look!" She moved the table away. "Look! Uncle Roman's feet!" Gorsky's feet were long and narrow, and at first glance there was nothing remarkable about them. His toes were almost as long as Daisy's fingers, but his small toe was disproportionately tiny and turned inwards in a way that made it look as though it was made of plasticine and attached as an afterthought to the foot itself. To amuse her, he wiggled his toes as though he was playing an imaginary piano with them. Summerscale's face darkened. He stood up and walked away. Daisy took the seat he had vacated and, sitting side by side with Gorsky, started imitating him. The sight of her feet stopped me in my tracks. Gorsky tickled the girl's right foot with his left. One silly plasticine toe next to another, much smaller but otherwise identical one. "You are a clever little girl, you know, Margaritka," he said in Russian, using the Russian word for Daisy. "My clever little girl." I did the maths quickly amid the stunned silence. He and I sat with the girl for quite a while, abandoned by our hosts. She had fallen asleep in her chair, and Gorsky covered her with a beach towel. Then Summerscale re-emerged. His mood completely changed. He was fully dressed and almost euphoric as he walked towards Gorsky and patted him forcefully on the back. "I'm sorry I left you, old boy. I remembered something that needed to be resolved instantly. But it's all sorted. We need to get moving. I told Natalia to get ready. We can't sit here on a day like this. London belongs to us." He uttered that last sentence in Russian and raised his arm towards the roofs, which seemed to pulsate with human energy. He lifted Daisy in her towel, and she hugged him without waking up. Gorsky said nothing. "Nick and I will go ahead," Summerscale said, "and grab a table at the Cabana in Notting Hill. Would you like to bring Natalia when she's ready? Jerry will look after Daisy." The promise of being alone in the car with Natalia must have tipped the scales. Gorsky nodded. I could hardly demur. Summerscale and I walked down to the underground garage. It housed the familiar silver limo, the Land Rover, a two-seater sports car, and a blue hatchback. The little car was dusty and full of clutter. I had assumed it was driven by one of their servants. Summerscale surprised me by jumping into it. The automated gate opened and we merged with the London traffic. I thought we were going straight to the Cabana, but Summerscale paused in front of a familiar house. "I'm sure you'll remember my accountant." He winked. Alawi opened the front door himself. He was in a bad mood, but he invited us in and seated us in a surprisingly neat little kitchen. He pushed another envelope across the table towards Summerscale. "The best you are likely to get in this town," he said. "Let's give you the Swiss, then." Summerscale counted out several 500-franc notes. "Where's the missus?" he asked casually. Alawi squealed like a wounded animal, hit his chest with a fist a couple of times, then started cursing. "That bloody whore. I locked that prostitute inside her bedroom a week ago. I will let her out when she admits that she has been cheating. She swears she is faithful, but she is an English whore. She is lucky I haven't killed her yet." He composed himself as quickly as he had lost his temper. He gave an ingratiating smile. "I am sorry, Mr. Summerscale. I am touched by your care." He escorted us out. Although I had some sympathy with Alawi in view of what I knew of his wife's activities, I was sufficiently concerned for her safety to wonder aloud if we should call the police. Summerscale laughed it off. "Oh, I've seen much worse from Mardi, old boy. They love each other in their crazy way, as much as I love my own missus. You know what Tolstoy wrote about happy families? He was wrong. The unhappy ones are all the same. We must allow the happy ones to be happy in their own ways." Natalia walked slowly and without making the smallest effort to look happy. Gorsky, on the other hand, practically glowed. I noticed, and Summerscale probably did too, that Gorsky's hand rested on her back as they made their way through the crowd. That gesture may have been the reason why, almost as soon as they were seated, he started talking about the beauty of Russian women. They were the best educated, passionate, innately elegant. But most importantly, Summerscale ploughed on, they are not poisoned by feminism. They are real women and proper, obedient wives to their husbands. Pity about the Russian men. Why? Inquired Gorsky. Neanderthal oafs, Summerscale said. They would rather marry an ordinary Englishman than a Russian millionaire. Gorsky had had enough. This Russian woman prefers a Russian man to you, Summerscale. Natalia stood up to leave, but he put his hand on her right shoulder and she froze in her seat. Her left hand hovered over his as though she was unsure whether to remove it or to grasp it. The wedding band, which she usually wore on her left hand rather than the right, the Russian way, was no longer on her ring finger. Why did she marry me then? Summerscale laughed. She's a refined soul, our Natalie, and you know it. She doesn't want a Yid arms smuggler. All that blood on her hands. Gorsky's fist put a stop to Summerscale's speech. The blow was so forceful that Summerscale's body, together with the chair he was sitting on, flew into the air before landing on the floor with a massive thud. The crowd fell silent. Gorsky's bodyguards, whose presence was so constant I had long stopped registering them, stepped menacingly closer. Natalia ran out before one of the waiters ordered the three of us to leave and threatened to call the police if we didn't. I straightened the chairs. Gorsky pulled a wad of 50-pound notes from his pocket and left them on the table, crumpled, red fingerprints all over the red paper. Summerscale blew his bloody nose into a paper napkin, dropped it over the money, then grabbed my arm and walked out. On our left, already almost at the top of Portobello Road, I could see Gorsky catching up with Natalia, remonstrating. Summerscale drove in the opposite direction. We were soon stuck in traffic on Shepherd's Bush roundabout. You seem fond of that word, I said. I did not know how to start talking about the situation. What word? He asked impatiently. I could see that he knew, but I repeated it anyway. Yid. You're very fond of the word Yid. What are you hoping to achieve with it? Change Natalia's mind? He snorted as he changed gears. I'm sorry about that, Nick, old chap, but I know what I was saying. There's no way she would leave me for that man, billions or not. He will forever remind her of borscht and poverty, and he knows it too. Why do you think she called our daughter Daisy? She doesn't even like to speak Russian if she can help it. 5 days later, Janice Alawi disappeared. I picked up the free newspaper from a stand at Sloane Square Station. West London woman reported missing. The picture must have been taken some years ago. Slightly flushed or slightly drunk, she looked into the camera with the feistiness I remembered from that strange evening in Soho with Summerscale. I phoned Jerry immediately. We had just met in a pub when, on a TV screen above the bar, Alawi appeared in a press conference looking every inch the wife-beater and murderer. Why were they letting him parade this pretense of grief? Alawi was unshaven, red-eyed and bewildered. The camera zoomed in on his face and his eyes welled with tears. Then he crumpled like a balloon deflating into the arms of a policeman who guided him away from the crowd and the cameras. What an act, I said. You know this man, Nick? Jerry said. Do you? He looks like a drug dealer. I couldn't quite work out if she really had no idea. Yes. I mean, no. Someone I know knows him, I stammered. All I know is that I don't expect his wife is alive. Jerry stared at me for a moment, then for some unaccountable reason decided not to press on. The next day, the ghastly plot took another turn. I was in a department store in Sloane Square. I raised my eyes from my purchase and saw, multiplied on several rows of TV screens, the familiar face of Janice's sister, red with hysteria and tears. The camera zoomed out, and I realized that they were standing in the doorway of a block of flats in Covent Garden. I had to get home. I dropped everything and ran down 4 flights of escalators and along the King's Road. I was out of breath when I switched on my little TV and collapsed into the chair in front of it. Sal was describing the way she had discovered her sister's body. She'd been convinced that Janice was on the run because of her husband's threats. She waited for her sister to return her calls. Then, as the days went by, she could wait no longer. The moment she opened the door of the flat, she knew. Her sister's body was on the sofa, face down. The room was a mess of upended furniture. She had clearly put up a fight. Mahmoud Alawi was still distressed, but there was a malicious glee in his misery when the focus of the inquiry moved to Tom Summerscale. I am devastated to lose my beloved wife in this way. Devastated that she was found in the flat of Mr. Summerscale, with whom I have had some business dealings over a number of years. But if she was unfaithful to me, then I am not at all sorry to see her dead. There is only one punishment for adultery. That last sentence, part accusation, part confession, was replayed over the photographs of Janice and Summerscale, now set side by side, looking like the most unlikely adulterous couple imaginable. I gave my statement to a couple of police officers. A solicitous young policewoman noted my words down. Her male colleague nodded when I tried to explain why I felt that Alawi was a liar, although I had no evidence for it. Details about Tom Summerscale dribbled out. His career as a legal advisor to powerful Russian business interests, his glamorous lifestyle, his young Russian wife, even his first wife and her undeniably decent Englishness. At first, everything seemed to indicate that he couldn't possibly have had anything to do with a murder as sordid as this. And Summerscale himself denied it adamantly. Yes, he knew her. Yes, they had even had sex on 1 or 2 occasions. It was pointless to deny that now. Yes, she had the keys to his Covent Garden flat. Of course she did. She was looking after it. A caretaker. A cleaner, if you will. He had meant to let it out, but had forgotten to do so. Well, London property was a good investment. It did not need to be put to work. No, he hadn't been there in weeks. And no, he had no idea how often Mrs. Alawi went there alone, or how much she was paid for her caretaking duties. One of his managers took care of that. I remained convinced of Summerscale's innocence, even after the victim's sister gave another interview. It is a lie that Janice was some sort of servant, just a cleaner, Sal said. You don't take cleaners to expensive restaurants and present them with designer clothes. At that, she waved a picture of Janice in a pink Chanel suit she claimed was a gift from Summerscale. 3 or 4 friends, all flunkies like me, came out of the woodwork to confirm the truthfulness of Sal's story. Like me, they were all at some point or other entertained by Summerscale, part of the same strange, happy household routine he seemed to have indulged Janice with. Who else could have killed the poor deluded woman? Suddenly everyone seemed to ask, but Thomas Summerscale. The most unexpected response to such allegations came from Summerscale's first wife. While Natalia remained, for public purposes, unavailable and aloof, Her predecessor agreed to be interviewed in front of her Gloucestershire cottage. She asserted that Tom Summerscale was a 24-carat cad, but no, not a murderer. Definitely not a murderer. No, not even in the heat of passion. Never. In spite of her valiant effort, he was taken into custody. The completion of my Gorsky assignment could not be deferred for much longer. I still walked dutifully to work from my now rent-free accommodation every morning, but once inside the barracks, I spent most of my time by the library windows, looking over towards the laurels, hoping to catch sight of Natalia or Jerry. It was during one such moment that Gorsky walked in on me. He apologized for disturbing me, absurdly, for I was clearly not working while supposedly still in his pay. I stammered something apologetic in turn. No matter, he interrupted me and stepped nearer to the French window. He started. I waited. I hadn't spoken to him since the body was found. I knew from Jerry that he had been on the phone to Natalia practically all the time, begging to take her away from London. Late at night, I had seen him leave the barracks on a motorcycle and disappear into the empty streets. The sight of him alone out on the street was almost shocking. He must have dispensed with his bodyguards for Natalia's sake. That he would make himself vulnerable like that seemed to me a more solid testimony of what she meant to him than even the edifice we were standing in. He continued after a long pause. She tells me that she knows he had been unfaithful, that she knows he isn't the killer, that he was with her every night and every day since that day at the pool, that he clung to her because he sensed that he was losing her. She told the police, but an alibi provided by his wife is not enough, it seems. We must wait until this is over, she says. I must wait. He flinched when he uttered the word wife, and he swung the French doors as though he was going to shatter the glass. But then, at the last moment, caught them, brought them back together gently, and walked out of the room. I was aimlessly pacing up and down the vast room when Gorsky returned, looking even more tortured than he had on the previous day. He continued his speech almost exactly where he had left it. You may think me an idiot, Nikolai, a holy fool. I remember her at 19, the prettiest, cleverest girl you could ever imagine. All the more beautiful for remaining so noble in those hideous surroundings. The Yeltsin times were chaotic. It was easy to make money, but just as easy to lose it, and more. Natalia's father saved my life a couple of times. I owed him loyalty. And she was meant for me. This was a simple mathematical equation, something stronger than us. Volkov asked me to look after her, and I promised I would. I am not sure I ever kept that promise. One of his bodyguards knocked at the door. Gorsky dismissed them for the night. Then he dismissed me. You did well with this library, Nikolai. I knew you would. Now go home and take some rest. You deserve it. That was the last time I saw him alive. It feels strange to say that the most important event in my life was one I witnessed only as a grainy image on CCTV. Although I had spent more time with Gorsky in that last year than perhaps anyone else on this planet, I knew little about him. His life remains a mystery. His death is a different matter. His last 4 or 5 minutes on this earth were caught on a film I played and replayed until I could no longer watch. The film comes from an American millionaire's security camera positioned on a wall which runs alongside the river path. 2 trees partly obscure the path. A man appears from under the crown of leaves on the left-hand side, walks along the path, leans over the railing, looks into the water for a couple of minutes. Then he turns and faces the camera, searches for something in his pocket, takes out a mobile phone, reading a message on its small screen. The faint glow lights the familiar Prussian profile. I'm not sure if I imagine this, but it looks as though his lips are almost about to spread into a smile. He puts his phone back in his pocket and turns as if to continue walking along the path. At that moment, a hooded figure runs towards him. He turns. The first flash of a blade catches his left shoulder. The second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth sink under the ribs. The attacker grabs him, takes something out of his pocket, walks away slowly, throws the knife into the river. He wears a black balaclava, a black leather jacket, a pair of dark trousers on bow legs, and incongruously light trainers with dark stripes. The victim clutches his stomach. He bends forward and drops onto the pavement. His body curls up into a question mark. A dark circle, like molten tar, slowly spreads around him. Unlike Janice Alawi, Roman Gorsky and his death capture the front pages immediately, and the inside pages. There were attempts to calculate his wealth and explain the source of his money. Apparently, there'd been murder attempts before, in Tallinn and Tel Aviv. But why wasn't he wearing a bulletproof vest that night? His bodyguards were not with him. Did they know? It was the Russian mafia, said a famous columnist. It was unlikely to be a robbery. Someone now retired from Scotland Yard pointed out, "You threaten and intimidate. You don't inflict multiple stab wounds in order to steal someone's mobile phone." At first, no one made a connection with the Summerscale case, although the police promptly made a connection with me. I told them about the bookshop, about the library commission, even about my holiday in Greece. I told them everything I knew about Tom and Natalia Summerscale too, although I was well aware that what I had to say did not help Summerscale, who was fighting his case against diminishing odds. It was Natalia, in fact, who inadvertently sealed her husband's fate, even as she fought to save him. Coming into the court, she looked shocked and pale beyond grief, beyond devastation. Alawi became visibly agitated when Natalia confirmed that she wasn't troubled by her husband's dalliance with Janice Alawi, and even more so when she added that no, she did not believe for a moment that Tom Summerscale was her killer. "Was Mr. Summerscale ever violent towards you?" the prosecutor asked. "No, yes, once," she responded. "He hit me once, just once." "How did that happen?" the prosecutor asked. "He believed he was not the father of our child." The silence in the room was absolute. Summerscale looked stunned. "And was he?" "He wasn't," said Natalia. "Who was?" insisted the prosecutor. "That is not relevant," interrupted the judge, who looked as smitten by her as I ever was. "So, if he hit you, how could you say that he's not violent?" the prosecutor ploughed on. "Because he isn't a violent man," she repeated. "I tested him beyond endurance. I deserved to be hit." Thus the scales tipped against Summerscale. Jerry's testimony did not help either. Her insights helped corroborate the claim that Summerscale was a cocaine addict and that Alawi provided the drugs. She also knew that Summerscale punched Natalia that day when we were all gathered at the pool. "Do you know why he punched her?" asked the prosecutor. "He was jealous," she said. "He believed that Roman Gorsky was Daisy's father." The public revelation of the connection between Roman Gorsky and Natalia Summerscale overshadowed everything else. Tom Summerscale's complex love life, his violence, his cocaine habit, even the jury's eventual decision that he was guilty. When she heard the verdict, Natalia looked like an exhumed corpse. Tom Summerscale screamed, a strangled, low-pitched scream, which sounded as though he was gurgling his own blood. The night Summerscale was convicted, Jerry came over to my cottage. She walked in and almost immediately set about tidying up, arranging my books, picking up bits of paper, washing used coffee and teacups which dotted the place. I realized that her need to create order came from some deeper derangement. Finally, she sat next to me and we looked out towards the unlit windows of the barracks as the night thickened around us. Natalia did not know what to do with herself, Jerry told me. It seemed impossible to leave Tom, and impossible to divorce him now that he was in prison. The reason to abandon him had vanished as well. She couldn't even talk about Gorsky. If you so much as mentioned him, she screamed. The only thing she wanted, Jerry said, was to die. But she couldn't do that either. Not with Daisy. I had never seen her cry before. I wrapped my arms around her. Another shiver ran through her like electric current. She took my arm off her shoulder. "Dear little Nikolai, you don't want to know how good you are. It won't help either of us." I was accustomed to having my decisions made for me in this way. I was used to strong women. The Bulgarian was perhaps the strongest of them all. While Gorsky's body rested in the freezer in the hospital on Fulham Road, the barracks descended into chaos. The rumors about the estate started circulating immediately. Some papers wrote that he had billions, some that he had no money at all. The police issued appeals to anyone who might recognize the murderer on the basis of his distinctive gait. There were trails, but they ran cold, one after another. Meanwhile, the Laurels remained shuttered and apparently empty. Natalia had supposedly left the country. Then I received an unexpected email from Jerry. Her message contained only the simplest of greetings and an attachment with a photograph. Natalia, Daisy, and she, in a cemetery near Montreux, visiting Vladimir Nabokov's grave. It was an outing organized by Natalia, Jerry said. I responded by asking a volley of questions. I received an automated reply, which left me none the wiser. Then, some hours later, a simple message in Bulgarian. "Still crying," it read. There was a single forlorn, frustrating X for a kiss. Finch, who had by a stroke of luck cashed the last of Gorsky's checks only a couple of days before the murder, declared that we would use the money to organize Gorsky's funeral as soon as the body was released. Since there seemed to be no next of kin able to fulfill the duty, it was, he said, the decent thing to do in return for all the money he had spent on and in the shop. It was going to be a cremation, followed by a memorial service. We arranged the latter in a synagogue off the Edgware Road, one of several he had endowed. It was a liberal, accommodating sort of place, and Victor knew someone who knew the rabbi well. We had no idea how many people would turn up, so We catered generously for 300, as many as the synagogue would hold. In the event, Finch, Victor, and I were the only mourners, and none of us was Jewish. When it became clear that no one else was going to show up, the rabbi, whose open-mindedness might have been stretched to its limit by a congregation consisting of 2 Anglicans and a Serbian Orthodox Christian, dispatched the woman cantor to summon a small group of elderly men and women away from some business which they had been pursuing in the bowels of the building. At least they knew the form. We read the words of the Kaddish and lit the candles for Gorsky's soul. It was difficult to think of a more impersonal service. No one knew enough about the man to make it less so. Finch read a speech about the Russian love of books. Victor recited a poem by Pushkin in a soft, lilting Cambridge Russian. That sound moved me more than anything else. It echoed with a sadness well beyond the life we were mourning. Elizaveta Alexandrovna Stern reminded me of my own mother. Her hands, speckled with the liver spots of old age, were just as bird-like as the rest of her. It was heartbreaking that she did not make it for the funeral service, she said, but it was already becoming obvious to me that she had indirectly allowed it to happen. She did not want to mourn him with his so-called friends or be photographed for the world to see. She could not understand so many things about the way her son had chosen to lead his life. She was a communist. That is why, although she loved Roman, and although he was a loving son, she steadfastly refused his money. She urged Roman to give his wealth away to the needy. The only God she believed in, she explained, was the common good of the human race. Roman, too, she added, he was good, hard-working boy, a communist himself. He lived modestly. He was proud of being Russian, and I was proud of him. I was honored to be his mother. I was honored to be his mother, she repeated when we stood by the Thames, just the 2 of us on the spot where his life came to its abrupt end, watched over at a distance by one of Roman's bodyguards. I opened the urn and upended it above the water. A plume of pale powder rose into the air and slowly descended into the murky water, pooling briefly, then disappearing under the surface. Elizaveta Stern stood next to me, now nursing the empty malachite jar. I did not dare ask whether she knew she had a granddaughter. I had to leave the revelation, if such it was, to Natalia and her conscience. When the final strange twist to this story happened 10 months later, at first it seemed like another case of random street violence. There was a robbery in Elgin Crescent in Notting Hill. A woman was forced to surrender an expensive watch at knife point, and a passerby, an off-duty soldier, tackled the robber. The criminal, a Tunisian, was a small-time drug dealer who had turned to mugging to support his own drug habit after his employer and supplier was jailed for drug-related offenses. The man's distinctive gait and an unusual card case in which he had stashed a few wraps of heroin provided incriminating evidence which helped solve an earlier, much more serious crime. He thought the case a worthless trinket. The pawnbroker had refused him a loan for £30 against it. It was a Fabergé. When he was challenged about the way it came to be in his possession, his confession was as quick as it was baffling. He had taken it from the pocket of Janice Alawi's English lover. He had killed them both, he claimed. Mahmoud Alawi, his boss, had ordered the murder, but he did not have to order anything. He killed Mrs. Alawi because he had wanted to kill her anyway. Mrs. Alawi, Janice, had been his mistress. He loved Janice, and Janice loved him. They planned an escape to the sun, a hotel on the Tunisian coast, which they would run together one day. She kept promising to leave Mahmoud, but she kept lying. Then, Mahmoud, suspecting nothing, revealed in his anger that Janice had another lover, an Englishman. The Tunisian confronted her. He threatened to kill her if she did not supply her lover's address. He was going to lie in wait and beat the bastard up. She obeyed, and she promised to leave Alawi for him yet again, but he killed the whore anyway. If she could not be his alone, she was not going to be anyone's. Of course, she let him into the flat. Well, they'd been meeting there regularly. She said that she was the cleaner, but to him, she was a paid whore. Having killed Janice, he stalked the Laurels over several days. His rage and his fear about being found out only grew. He saw the Englishman with his wife several times. Late one night, he saw him kissing her on the doorstep. He followed him, and he killed him. No, he did not know anything about anyone called Roman Gorsky. He saw his victim's face clearly. Well, it was the same man whom he had watched going in and out of that house. He killed an Englishman. He was absolutely certain, not a Russian, and certainly not a Jew. On the day I finally moved out of the gatekeeper's cottage, Tom Summerscale was released from prison and the barracks went up for sale for several £100 million, an insignificant slice of the fortune Gorsky had left to Daisy Summerscale. There was a fortune after all. It was also the day I met Natalia for the last time. I had taken a flat share in Mile End. I hired a small van with a merry Romanian driver who leant against his battered vehicle and whistled while I carried my boxes into the van. He halted mid-tune when Natalia emerged from her own massive gateway across the road. She was carrying a small hamper. To make sure that I would have something for dinner wherever I was going, she said. I had not realized that she was back in London until that moment. I invited her upstairs, into the now empty room from which I had watched Gorsky's palace being dismantled and rebuilt again, just for her. We stood, facing each other uncertainly. It occurred to me that we had never had what one could describe as a proper conversation. I fetched a book from one of my boxes, a cheap paperback. It was a Soviet art history book which used to belong to Gorsky long before I started compiling his library. I stole it from his shelves the day after his murder. I already knew I needed no mementos. There was no way to forget him. An ex libris bookplate inside the front cover had the initials RBG penciled in. A few of the inside pages still carried his scribbled annotations, asterisked names of artists with Natasha mentioned, or as explained by Tasha, or liked by Talia. He had many pet names for her, as Russians do, but I don't remember him ever addressing her by any of them. She briefly pored over the book, then leafed through pages of black and white photographs. "These pictures take me back," she said. "There were months when we existed on potato soup alone. Not just my family, the whole town. I understood very early on how important it was to have plenty of money, because money shielded you from so much. I am sure you understand that." I did not understand. I had never thought money shielded you from anything. When Roman arrived in Volgograd for my father's funeral, Natalia said, he refused even to acknowledge my presence, let alone speak to me. I had just arrived from London. I had been married to Tom for several months at that stage. I was always fond of Tom, and I was not unhappy with him, but I had wanted to escape Russia so much and for such a long time that I did not know what to do with myself in London. When Tom was away, I paced up and down the apartment we were living in, and I cried all the time. Then my father died, and I was convinced that I had killed him, that my marriage was the cause of his heart attack. He hated Tom. He hated Britain. He had other ideas for me. There were all these old men at his funeral, old communists in bad suits, frail and doddery. They looked at me as though I was the enemy. Then they played an army march Dad loved, the farewell of Slavyanka, and I could no longer fight back tears. Suddenly, Roman came over to me and put his arm around my shoulder. No, no, Natasha, he whispered. No, no, my little one. You must never cry, my love. When you cry, the world stops making sense. She fell silent for a while. I was trying to make sense of her astonishing confession. I could hear the Romanian outside turning the van for its journey east, then honking once or twice. There was a little stub of a pencil on the floor, and Natalia bent down to pick it up. She rolled it on her palm for a while, then put it in her pocket. She added one final sentence to her story. The following day, I flew back to Moscow, and then on to London to my husband. But it was on that evening that my daughter was conceived. I bought back my parents' apartment in Belgrade for a sum much lower than I had sold it for 20 years earlier. I run an English language school for children whose parents dream of money and escape. I have a girlfriend, a local girl, an English teacher, 15 years younger than me. We've been living together for over 2 years. She does yoga, and she aligns her chakras. She breathes in deeply, she holds her breath, and she exhales. My girlfriend has pinned a card above my desk which reads, "Do not be afraid to let go." She is still a child. How can she know that I had, for a long time, found it impossible to hold on to things? When I think of London now, I think of Gorsky. People like Gorsky made it temporarily a great Russian city, the second St. Petersburg, the new Moscow. Their children, now being educated in expensive British boarding schools, will never know the same thirst. In time, they too will become like the English. The new conquerors will come from India and China to spend and to buy, as the Russians did. Strange to say, but I am at peace. My girlfriend talks about the importance of keeping your thoughts anchored in the present. Neither the past nor the future exists. To please her, I sit next to her on her yoga mat and we meditate together to the pre-recorded sound of the waves. I follow her prompts. I inhale as deeply as I can. I hold my breath. I let go. I close my eyes, and I see a plume of white powder floating over the Thames. The world stands still.
Philip Arditti was reading the final part of Gorsky by Vesna Goldsworthy, abridged by Isabel Creed. It was produced by Jill Waters and is a Waters Company production for the BBC.